Sales minister ako truul mausubes tial hearing mal schedule at 8:00 umisra tayo na mafodori unfortunately session ako mal kasi the predict crossing mumre at 3:00 di chairman of house direct apologize morgalak mga sir adam direct mingil di amal mle tutorial tial hearing Minister kami tengil wasing kami sendera response regal may mumle so am ngar opportunity regal nem ga kam present mer mam trial adam diru era domule dik mutal tal ko ay so seto atal senator sa ukmle wangedel ngar tial hearing may lak tik kumura tisiye ga wangeda floor leader senator Oilouch adiregal senator senior senator Inabo senator ni rewangan ya uk telbida umgira chairman of house asetia mo joint hearing uk mo wala sa chairman of house uk mo aisra adal uk me mangila chula
Sulang chairman whips minister Hayes ma rest of the people yeah president LC is here I'm happy to be here as a chairman of Ways and Means of the House at the invitation of Chairman Whips, Chairman of Ways and Means on the Senate and the Committee of Ways and Means of the Senate to have included us as we start our public hearing going forward on this very important bill. I forgot the number of the bill, but I guess we all know we're here to get some thoughts and some comments relating to the proposed tax reform that's pending in the Committee of Ways and Means and the Senate. Here with me from the House Ways and Means is Delegate Otto, who is the Vice Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee of the House, and then member Delegate Marino Mamayas. We had a session this morning. We were expecting a little bit more members of the House to be here, of the Ways and Means, but for other prior commitment, they're not here. But they might join the committees 7 p.m. at the IRI Center for the hearing on behalf of the people of IRI State. With that, thank you, Chairman.
Sulang Chairman edik bok patiklim marada blu setial bill dosadnia 9-14 etiang of course ang le proposed en mora ula le sera February tiam la mre garak mlamu la uriol girel of course minister gamle submitra le mer sera December dori engari atri madringa recommendation organ ngara alsin mang akti kimo ngaula maskaw mo introduce ra adam and then maybe como comment tergira tial babilingem el mergamam yedrega el bonia atelem tigal adam ngartiang al sumania yel soril mokmunge ate al bomdo so ale waise ministere pescaula chulo
Malsaule Senator Whips malungil yetasil sile korgau ma trigal member sa Senate ma member kami tirgar Senate ma mora chairman isaal ma member kami tirgar house edregal bike mutal te alle kurenga sulim lo sibiul invite ramam en mertal mal cloud to el bill el vice el blamol gorin sen Senate bill 9-14 di era ulmon ma ala ke chair make introduce tirgal adlo bunge kama on my right Chan Hayes gaya advisor mera blur belau lorora IMF el girela tax gaya bodo tuiringir el almo musinda mom sauda tegi del gira albangangil bill angara left nga ka ngari amar ka orol ngara PITI USTA gaya economic advisor Ministry of Finance gaya ko ngara sige del statistics lo all to lasya the raise tax ma revenue ngo ko ngara telela improvement tra economy rigid adire ka lo bangeta el alta ma marka recover nga as a lawyer nga ngara 18 ding lawyer tax en ka dire kal dimle on board man dire kal way nga kal dire kam super tal vessel tax e kami of course am dang liya awrayan nga uluro lo bang gamiu elang legal counsel ra president e dire kal me help nga kal lo mesa serogil la album introducer ngi e help nga kal dire kal draft ay gid respond dire kay gid chairman amo bangge kara el alsil sel mo trial explain ra gil guk position ra mam ma so that at the end el ngaringa gel korap to kal ngir manger el guk kal understand ada blue em lamo sebil mo understand tal doru ni makote chairman eng waigel bla dadung tal VAT de kal PSL to koy tiang sel domu ra domesagel baber ma domu ra domesagel tele laurel en ulmu ra 1988 ngirogul government telmet mu and create a task force and mo mesatial structure tax gid la mega various recommendations seltal meg en dimel mera al sela ulolela olbil malubeng obisa president e de kal mu bul nga tara step akmalol ngit akmal lawrenga sulil mos yang mos edal ku gomeser tagi del bill of lam introduce 9-14 do rol girel explaining il more other blue was en why en necessary al ubengara ulum close to $3 ngi ngara lurei ta sum kad mongu yang mo sab edal malmol mra awngil revenue mera blue bela makote chairman di bokso dia tele la korarole la sel taxa structure gider el all time sel tungwak lalo lo tungi el hitra customers ra wangar along malubeng giray blilyo eng 11% ta tax sel blada dungu lo lar sel aralak lalo niya kita moltran ngil moral sel tu aklalo el kada charge tira 3% el import eng mora wholesale eng otrur ra retail el 4% eng mora retail eng ulotrur ra customers el 4% Besel ed ay geng el cascade ngil me au era el rich ra ngidil customer abru bela en 11%. Sel do mes tale tax system ergid en cascade el morio o otil was en ngaria double taxation ra process len sel tal ngurawan ra adan mun matra ade ka eda gid el tax. Ongerunge chairman na ulmung te level ko omes ra tal existing el tax system ergida mal alawa claw non-compliance, mal claw adal legal file amaral telete amaral legal letiang cross visit tax mengaria double visiting ngaria sel bibira igal sioba obong en double abok ketingir le sel bod adit en digel ngarakyas resistera ege asel sertir meng ege gida giril pe tax sertir etni kel blodek record ada kata mal claw loophole setial existing tax system. Ul mengklau tu telela adomes ra different tax system whether ko color ngil VAT malubang whatever the name sal sadal mo color ngi omes ngil sa kad makarang ekut makli mo close out the segi del close loopholes this is still time and generate a revenue that less than what we carrying as of today. Segi da ko awal challenge segi del kita mo omes ngi Mang ul magiguk recommend elal tiagi del value added tax al kita albang ringi ka mla kami amla introduce ringi 9-14 omes ringi lo tiagi del value added tax hablado sub ringi en over gagi del guk neighboring island ringi edregal mla omes ringi lo en taxa gel adal lo spesegi del klaloa a persegi del tax e de do sisil time asa a tax a collector ngira upfront se atra klungyolel e de do sisil time ngari gel document deductible a expenses el morngi e ge dak para detail ngi le sel bol representation a chan hayes en mo malway magote Ministry of Finance oldu ra auldaso e wedere ko kolon ngil value added tax malubeng ngal tax di ko doldu ra uldas will mo improve ra tel existing system kita angaring el altan lengla tianga gegel tasel all the titi i time tiagi del dia takat maklin mel mutre lang. Direkal meringir gidaleng jakal si edel meringir gidal ngos clear rate ngil ngara form ora 5 direkal meringir gidal ngasara CIF mora FOB mungire dalo mesa betok tele la sekal mukara rulawan la taxel revenue taxel kita mo ultirak ngi el efficient ter adra blu understand ngi ma shawa direkal civil benefit ngi seguida men el color gid es el last el malgire del men el color gid ase mar adalo uror direkal civil beot el direkal implement ta gid el system el gida amalat ka mo malarngi el VAT ongerung el wanara recommendation er gid tial value added tax chair o modong lilo seng ndiakal apply il mora gerogul business de recommend ngil mora gerogul mo close business el selva bilngi le korkawa recommend ngil was el mora akombali el gelse setir 100% 100,000 or above ya our reasoning el kirel segi de was ya selbo borior 100,000 en ndiakal enough for other lo ngara tax mo implemented tagi del VAT ya ongeru nga assume kung kadam concentrate resource gidra lower than lower yang mal mo expensive el da sebel mo mal expensive mang ndiakal word ra temedel mo implement say edregal ngat tagi dem so ko makarar tirgel guk ngara tigel earning tax sales tira less than 100,000 a year. They give remain ang atyal util system and they give recommend a lower CRT at 4%. Siya recommendation al direkal ngara atyal. Ya iga di recommendation nga ka madingel as sell threshold a debatable mo mobile morbab whatever the sige del threshold ma sel amount tra si artil seng ngari al ubenda kasi di mo yor kami di ka mo mrula analysis lo seng ngari effect ra revenue kita mo generate al ubenda dilegal aquí recommend ra sige del 12.5% Weigel gulgol as el all time en 11% sel dotto dia se ada bolo marak lalo ika kama maria recommend ra 12.5%. The sell recommendation are other IMF amla mergid lo sea 10% a revenue neutral. Agi recommend ra 12% el kora ngaringi segi del adjustment tergid ra implementation ama additional revenue al sumang bral kira del mo sumang ngaringi revenue mo additional. Ongerung el direkal ul magi recommend ra segi del 12.5%. Kita madangelo sea sel mga kampak tergideng kita mlamo gede del dimo gidel mo raise revenue mo o umere sel difference ra kampak del drawdown kita malarngi kita al time malara may del 14 million na kampak el plus ra 5 million na trust fund mo 18 million la global uran ra government tergid sel bola ka sel 14 million yang ra andera kampak te mo malara 15 million mengaringi shortfall ra 3 million revenue bodobal mo balance ra bache tergid al sumung mo dekada edregal ander seguid schedule kampak ngari scale down ergid seguid el withdrawal ra sel trust fund mendiregal ludas la sengire del ngwa seguid el rate tergid el domlas wen kakan fortable ngil dakal guk sal burden ra aigal siobai at the same time ekadamita obligation sergid el ngara andera kampak ma igal services sergida a provide al morar adrabalo Aigel bibile chairman recommendation nga ka ngara while implementation del VAT ya akumdaswe esel erabok marege self presentation ang kal rubaka mo kabere gel bibila recommendation ang kal in detail mong abol merekse nga kasi kal mama si amle en serege gidel bibira question na di challenge so kal dire kal dulir elara era kildra flor mora jana sel administration side ringi mahal mo expensive. Expensive radak dula sing personal resources el all time ang marala kora orientation ma training el mora staff ra kamam tan la mo familiar atial process ra VAT tasambarial girel ang kora rolil mo during adi sel mo side ra hardware ma software ra computer bodos perngi se ang arak medal 1.2 to 1.5 million al sumo kada mo o malara already made el software lo bangela ka hardware me installer ngi segidi amo challenge segid agidi sakalo ay sa segi mo malmol malawro lo bangela government Australia mani Chilen na malsum sa adungul Quran te kadungu ala ka yaktik mulara ulda saldo swiwe endire kal ngani agel bulbul at takol was spend your money where your mouth is etial taxa giredel lo trangal spend out do del girela mang selbolo ure kada mo buri kabera ke kita sea tara ul mga kitsa chestra ure tel gibel ngarba balaseng podulura budget process se edelo mes cycle additional revenue longar kal mo improve Bureau of Revenue and Tax mensi ilmu ra already 100% mo implement ra mundi ke gida agora overview chairman tial el presentation ra ngakal girel tial implementation ra tial bill kumyane passing el RP al Senate Bill 9-14 e bai kuma ula ngum sa Chan Hayes mo bol godru ra tiaro gil bill ma agel process raklalwa bill 2 tungwal tela taksa mbol ko amoriak na mandir at ebura da bora kerman asku mendiu ngirar ngome chairman
sulang president ako minister ako muralo aseng malungileng gal advisor ang artiang ang boria telel gora smodin diso kal gora di highlight difference self el plan proposal el amended la el more cell original just so ara drablo more understanding it sir got la el bill proposal niya seneta wal bill proposal 7% el tax same na base ra 4% plus 3% nung no to say 7% diregal quadi so kalo ay sa dimle 17 pages ak numatel tial blam submit rin me 53 page oy tribal wal gora okrok diregal wabla mo si isel el proposal battle mo 12.5% mang waise minister ng adiregal gora yad mo gelo asing mal selo urang malungil telang kami tia mal kuram le tur selo das asing kada makarang deka bodo impact ra blu mang ka akti igaw mo mere kala advisor ka mo present and disida kuram le das we maybe agel details and numbers later on ka so kal mo ogira be bilgiren sate alang kal advisor mo pulong do sulang.
Thank you, Senators, Delegate, Minister. Thank you for allowing me to come here today and speak to you about VAT. Just as you can see on the slideshow there, my name is John Hayes. I work with the IMF, and in that role I work in their regional office in Fiji. It's the Pacific Financial Technical Assistance Centre, which is PIFTAC. My role is specifically taxes, and that's what I've done all my life. Some people would say it's boring to be a taxman all your life, but it allows me to come to beautiful countries like Palau and other countries in the Pacific and help people with their taxes.
So lang yung minister ma umildaliget to buklo so mimiskate alamak mertiare la sid sa mo musesay te idel on sa mo sa slide ang clear at yan hey sa nga tara advisor sa idel lobby sa piftal nga sel kukko kaya lobby sa nga fichi sa idel kukko bis sa idel ti sa gida ukra Pacific sa lobby sa yang adra tax mong sa munda sa tax ang igel mendok sa sa larong ngil toy ning rula mak blood so egal mera yidel mat lo wala ngil bulu et maro ngarngi ut mom sa da yidel tora tax. So
there's a fair bit in value-added tax, so I'm going to try and keep it as as broad an overview as possible, but please ask questions if you feel like you want to ask questions, because if you have a question, other people will have questions too.
Tial tokora value added tax mal mall meringil om soder tokoy endik mo malas hindi mga deberingin mo sabi edel gukti mo raigel wal mal etayid tokora value added tax hindi gulgit ko mo gera katsumani akora au the sul so malubang gera so miloger e mo gera mel sabi edel smart mar adro gui boloding.
So the three major themes of my presentation today are why does Palau need a VAT? How does a VAT work, and what's the impact of VAT, the impact on the community and the impact on government? So I'll work through those three areas and try and explain why we think a VAT is very good for Palau. I might...
Nilagel wal kaldel niya wal teltial nga mo polol trilo ko kumiu awasing ngra mabela ospert gidel ospert gidel VAT tax mga tetele la lorior mangarang ruli malubang ngrang mo ngove ira role la balu ma kuk tokora abalwadal rasel do role la tax.
And before I go on to that, I might certainly just clarify my role as to give advice. The ultimate decision on what you do with your taxes is a decision for the Congress in Palau. The IMF will give advice, will give recommendations. I personally, as I've said, I've seen a lot of tax systems, so I'll tell you what I think you should do, but the decision is Palau's ultimately, not the IMF and not PIFTAC.
So di ba mo taktik mula sa gero gul boktu may geluldas wawadi bolol masera government travela ma adro olbire belal mo milito la sengara senia ngila al tletal o mosperi ngwayel blaktu la sekmal na mesa togol bek patingela role la tax mungukti sa bekal mo ay sumik pa sa ngara udo swa kay gidel bek patingela role la tax mangara umdas ngilo mospe ni senia mo lobong len mo kasing tanggel mo mal makatakti wa sengara o mospe ni adra government kami ma adra olbire kami.
So firstly, some general observations on your tax system. And these observations came from the IMF mission to Palau in August last year, when they were generally reviewing how you manage your tax system.
Elang otek sa wadi bol bok tungay ge uay sa bebira gel nga kamlames ra arole la tax ra kami. Elang yel bok uay smol bak mo ol ay gel silbiray tila dra IMF al minister August Emiles yida bokko yida yung cross begal mes mo olta uswegari.
One of the first observations about your tax system is that most countries around the world now have a tax system that balances taxes on income and profits with taxes on consumption. But generally Palau is quite old-fashioned in that it doesn't follow most other countries.
Atasel gimil sa umsin del bulura blulaf ang ania role la tax til wal del limong mota basula au do del sois maigel ludo del gombali al sumu trucklalo se awabol geringi maigel lidisa la klal ad ospe malubeng igel service ad ospe andi sel system malubeng sel vela ospe ni role la tax awal di alungod au umsin del bulura blulaf de mo util teleta.
Now I did use the word old-fashioned, and I don't want to use that in any derogatory sense. Old-fashioned in the sense that you've had this system for a long time, and most Pacific countries inherited their system either from the British system or the US system, and almost every one of those countries realises now that they need to modernise their tax laws.
Amaruringil wal kora makitel tokoy sektung utuk pa sa mal makatakatangal teletal mo speni o masindel belul mo nganya role la tax ringi awalong usel teletal sel belul wal mo korortir wal mo meseti say dal ngilo al silu birtir teletal British malung merigel ndi o masindel belu amla malalme o mesla sing guk amla mo ngil ngadia sel.
So the two major taxes that you have a lot of taxes in Palau, but the two big ones that fall in my area are your tax system taxes employment income. All employees know that, they pay tax on their wages, and it has a gross revenue tax, which is effectively a turnover tax. That's a consumption tax that is ultimately passed on to the consumer, the people in the street. So the people in the street pay the consumption tax and they pay their wages tax.
Ilangan igel tablo teletara tablo tax ang ngaringin nga ka wabol 6% wak mukudang alil balwak mudu oringil teleta ngaring igel tax suma ada ududel yang adro wadim dingil adro gulududel hara sa igel tax. Mangari sa igel waseng gross revenue tax ese sel tax el hara ri trigel adro spera klalo se se lunga seng turnover en igel tablo el nga ko meso Atrial adra blu, atrial adra blu, harar ngegi del tax nura udira sum go ure ha makara u mo sugori e direct el mutun tahara tax sel bolo la klal malut mo aria bolo la bolo arni tahara direct el taxes.
So one of the major reasons that I see why you need to reform your tax system is because GRT is passed on to the consumer, employees pay taxes, business people don't pay any taxes, and that puts business people at a distinct advantage. If someone earns $10,000 from employment income and their neighbour earns $10,000 from a business income, they're both basically the same, but the employee is worse off because they pay taxes.
Misal مسا del teletara tax and al tabasu le langa ke del del TRT awal gudungulo luidrinil mol selul bong leng morngel ad ngia mo spera aklalo mang elanga ad lo shobai amrania dagal haram wal tetela lagal harara tax ngel ad guk sum teteru seldo mes o si sum teteru ad lududira al sela tarra ngari atri tela elangel ad lo rior el mangarger seguid lududer le urira con balinga belmenta amo harara ingab tax min siya bul harara tax ni ending el adlo so shoba ada abul harara tax mun josi siul tril telala lo al longorger bingi ending kay gid lo real harara income tax awal la tabsul umrul al morgi.
So the main IMF observation in August was that Palau does need to have a modern tax system. That tax system is necessary so that you can build a strong economy. It will affect your budget, and in the medium term you have the impact of the compact funding coming into play. So now's the time to plan for the future.
Museriata litsanga adra IMF sinalmera August awase avela agire los rulik tan role la taxatir mo ateri ma bukka tamere lang e ositam se sum bukko mesra telgiben ngarmaga ngiri la vela ruli mom sisi age sargi المصاب إلا الدينيلو التقاريم سيل شو منقوك تلبون تقرا عن باك الغيا يا بلا سب الدينيلو التقارا أو تقرا دوب دوفير.
Yes, Delegate.
John Hayes, I just want you to clarify again because you don't want people in the local people to watch this to be confused. The distinction between a guy who's working and paying income tax, who makes $10,000 a year, actually pay income tax. And then the guy who's in business doesn't pay tax.
Yeah.
Just make it clear, the guy in business pay tax, but it's collected at 4% from the customer. So the business in Palau are paid the GRT. But what you're saying is, you should clarify, business in Palau pay taxes now, but it's collected from the customer.
Sala lo business le ngedi al harara tax sala bol la tax wase gel business harara seguir el TRT tax ending walo lara madala udel gel adlo marra claro nga seguida wa bol claro sin diswa bol la tax le mora.
A very good example would be on Tuesday I was talking to the Palau Tourist Association generally about VAT, as we have here now, and one of the professional people in the audience said to me that he hasn't paid taxes ever since he's been in Palau because he passes the GRT on to the consumer.
Tara malungil logosi wa sera ongeru loriora gimin ngodo tigeladra Palau Tourism Association. Tatriel adal la sel min ngodo do asay mlamong tetara sera gotel merbe mo yorbe la indirga al hara tax le tara gotel mal ul seguida mu seguida TRT awal lungul bol melar lo laringi ngel ngia adal muharal uspera klal ma lubang uspera a service.
And that person could work in government as a professional person, provides professional services. That profession is in government. Those people in government doing almost the same work will pay tax, but the business person who provides professional service doesn't pay tax because they make the consumer pay it.
Say why actielado na alimento sa barin mruro o sisiu rior, alubang o sisiu el service al provider ngi, and the other na alimenta ngaria la tax la harangi, and ninga ida la sunguk tingi ngia o provider service malung ngaria o loru ringi, and the alara sa ida ti tax le ngu wabolo la ringi ngel ad ngia on se ringi malung ngia harangi mruro rior.
So some of the recommendations arising from the IMF, and as I pointed out before, they're only recommendations and Palau will make the ultimate decision, has led us into this tax reform debate, is to remove import tax exemptions on food, personal use goods and government goods and services.
Matarigel niya IMF o meso la sengire el motmok el gire tayid el tora taxa amouti selo ase ndia dolara taxra gal taxra clalo tertama del talado sperni ma taxra government so ala pon multa che gide bodia polalo dorutto poi.
The mission also recommended that you change your system of valuing goods, that the WARF move to a CIF valuation.
Matara director mio somama se elang modia dola se clalo wal tela aral malubang ra wal sel aral ra sel liger radial setial lo mari radial o mul mora sel do modoric was in CIF valuation.
I recommended that you introduce an excise tax system that would apply to selected goods that are imported and manufactured in Palau.
Director como apply sel do modoric was in excise tax el mora torgok claro ni o molchis bra blur belau ma direct claro ni malu claro ngal malu ni ye claro ni amru ra sel belau o apply ngi de do modoric was in excise tax mo ngi.
They recommended that the rate of net income tax for financial institutions should be increased because these financial institutions pay a very low rate of tax in Palau and they pay most of their tax in the US. Under international convention, that tax should be paid in Palau.
Financial institutions arwabang ay gidelen awmsin del taming adomesin el tama ang harar mali el tax al merbelau e clot tax al harar ngil mura blura migel endi seldo mesa hukka tora usngel la ul adn yuek es el tax agil harar ngil belau.
So they well yes Senator.
Yeah, and I just like to, go back to the previous slide. There's three things there that I think it would be good if we clarify a little bit. CIF means currently items are taxed at the value of where they were imported from. CIF means to include the freight.
Ang soal lo bukod clear to atara mula ton labdria sa CIF. Kasi CIF wal ludi mo kring sel arala durok sel durok rin may hindi dak masadra sel tal arala klal sel balloon ngati lo bodring.
Ela sel tax al time ngara FOB, which means ngara sel blue tilo bodring. The recommendation or IMF say modakkar sel olin la dial el moldi mo sel bom gay sangar ter taxea sel labora selongero. The second thing is the excise tax. I think that needs to be clear. The excise tax is those taxes like for cigarettes, alcohol. You could call them the sin taxes, or you want to reduce the consumption of those kind of things. So you would have excise taxes on those products, right?
Yep.
Kaya belasel do sa excise tax. Ako dumaloko tax mo ra rom madko ayel sel lo modo sa tax lo sin tax ayel klalo suave lo ngaya sa leather why say.
So a timing the excise taxes we have are like on soda, alcohol, tobacco, cars, and actually imported water. So that's, and then I guess the last one is the net income tax on financial institutions. Now, that only, the recommendation of the IMF is only on financial institutions. What you were saying is to cover all businesses. I think one of the issues that was brought up, because these were introduced as amendments to the budget that passed, and I think one of the concerns why they were removed was that on the floor, the issue was, well, if you tax the financial institutions more, they're just going to pass that on to the consumer. So now those services from the banks just going to cost more anyway. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit, because that was the major reason why they were removed from the budget bill. Thank you.
At sendo lokon seguid el net income tax mura ka siobay ma ajarwabang ge taramle klolo ulmo milngup tersel sel villa budget sel nya ula wablo lom sel da dunia blo lom daswria mlo mandara ula la asi sel omo asi tax ya gid el siobay ma lubong kombali etwa bolungu el mortirgel agel tiro uspe ay gid el tora wabang ma
Yeah, thank you, Senator. In one way or another, taxes are normally passed on to the consumer, but the net income tax is a little bit different because of the international conventions that currently play in tax. Now, most banks in Palau are related or are subsidiaries of international banks, of US banks. US law requires all those banks to pay tax in the US, but it will give a credit for the US, for the Palau tax. So it doesn't matter how much tax is paid in Palau, because the US will give a credit for it. And if the tax rate in Palau is low, it just means the US government gets more. So the bank isn't really affected by paying tax in Palau, because they pay those taxes anyway.
Seldo sada rela tax, misal sa ito ni seldo sada rela tax, en blow arugul tax ang di mo selbol magim ng morgel adan niya uspera aklal mo service. Ni selgo ka bodo sada tokora anit income tax sa gidu tokora wabang en tergibel mo ngod leng ngani gel watol clown mo dingera tokol blura blulat e osi silta me seldo mesa usin del bangal ngar belaw abang wal di mukriya maklol bakal ligel maklol obis tira ngam ligel matahara taxul muram ligel melang seldo ya dal ulam ligel al sugum ka kahara wa su tigel bakal ngal bela hara taxul belaw sel guk tax al hara ngam ligel amorio sel la hara ngir belaw sel wal ngabti sel tax al hara ngam ligel mung dia al yol wasa belaw ngak lungel taxul lo larngi leng di mo ngil mortun moram jakah man ngat il moray galbang adolgoria sel sum ngere tax al harari na blur belaw en klo tax al harari am lige ngere al mu belaw en klo al ngam.
So a couple more recommendations, thanks Senator, a couple more recommendations from the IMF, and the main one which brings me here right now is to replace the GRT with the value-added tax. The value-added tax is the fastest growing tax in the world, and I have a slide later on that talks about the advantages of a VAT. But the IMF is recommended that you should replace your GRT with that.
Misalnya, mata sen imura ko teklo el gumama al adra IMF ako assembly awa ngoti to kuk ngodi GRT mo ya mo special tax ng ngoi pasig GRT mo special del value added tax. A value added tax atara ko tel klo a uren al umral mo toys kel ad uspering il tax na blulad. Mga recent slide na mo olol tari mo ko mesa igel wasing raklung yolel ma lubang raw klaro sa value added tax material tax on spending.
The second recommendation was to extend the existing net income tax to all taxpayers, registered taxpayers in Palau. The reason for that being that, as I mentioned earlier on, people who earn wages pay tax, but people in business generally don't pay tax, and that's unfair for the general community. It means people who can least afford to pay the taxes have the highest burden.
Adina kaltara seli malgi mo ngale ergumio ado gelan mo mlo ringi selo asing mom relim seguid el ngarngi el altam net income tax lobol no tabsul ma adro gui bol hararni tirgel logrior earnout do ma tilogrior kabelment malubong showbai also sabarir harar osi tax leng el altamen tirgel adr tira da sabarir walu mri tira harar tax tiya otto klol berada tax o mobile misteri el alta.
The recommendation in relation to small business was to introduce a low rate of turnover tax for small business, because small business have the least capacity to comply, so they're looking to make it very simple for them to pay taxes with a very low rate of turnover. And related to that, the very small micro businesses should pay just one tax fee at the same time as their business licence, to make it easier and to make the system more efficient.
Atara yel direct limul mesni asa yel ngari yel dula say inteliyul migare shobay pol lansal maqtuhud mesel harara tax mal mortir pol tiyul merio ba yel mutan mal migare shobay di pol hara dil imol harara tax ra business license la pol legal seguida tagi mo mesni sab el mokol mo masyo.
So in recommending that the GRT be replaced, we've identified some of the disadvantages of a GRT, and it favours high profit margin businesses as opposed to low profit margin businesses, because businesses that make a very small profit have the same rate of GRT as a businesses that make a very high profit. So it's not fair.
At ayatara yel wal elbulot ni lalo asen wal jakalungi letagil atletan el tax domodoric masing TRT wal long ale ortirgel show ayel show bay klolu do dalo sisibi len ela kla show bay klolu do dalo sisibi ade sisil taxa de sisiplo ela taxa al hararni mengel mal yagre show bay el bukti yagre a lo sisibi men dial tabasula wala gikula say mungil dalungil tayel wal dola sum kantil ngai del TRT tax system.
GRT does not take into account business costs because it's payable on the gross revenue.
TRT tax real direct tarkantil real lo mesel wal lo do del mo itringi lo malas lo melu rangal shobay len malara yel rogulu tel taxa mangara yel rogulu do del soiso ya lo mesel seguido lo mo itringi mo rangal shobay.
GRT discourages capital investments because you need to pay duties and taxes at import on those capital investments, whereas a VAT will allow a credit for the taxes you've paid at the wharf.
Ela tegi del GRT awar li meng jar malada soril seldo mayel tora mayel do moik masing capital investment en mal beto ala tax ayel tax al harara yegi de klalo sois bravo sis bra adial ma yegi de beto tax aruli ala da al sal da al sal soril ad mosayid el dongdo capital investment ngai del VAT system amoruli mo seldo mo do pasai sel bodo credit malugong wabo do las ni sel tax mo se vela yegi del work capital investment mo klon ada mo.
And I think, John, it would be helpful if you explain what capital investment in layman's terms. Is that like investment in a hotel? Maybe you can explain that a little bit. That would be helpful for the public.
Capital investment can come in a number of forms. It can come, as you say, that people might want to build a new hotel. Generally, there would be a lot of imported goods that come in that they would pay tax on, and quite often they come to government and say, can we have an exemption from tax, which is really bad for the government. VAT takes into consideration people who want to invest in buildings. If you bring in plant, if you need to bring in a new truck, VAT will give you a credit for the tax paid on the truck, which is a form of capital investment.
Wasa senator atora capital investment yen nya maklol mo tawdo niya wa hotel la se adsum wa sumada mer vela son mo hotel en maklol taxa bola ni ge klalo chisbel mururungi TRT da al sabel wal lapsange sunge gi del af ndi se obra VAT la se bolo mo hotel bal to klar ge del chism en rumurtel meravelment lo ni travelment malagal taxa yel klalo chism ndi se maknitel meravelment Elangal VAT amo masasay mong muruli mong masabe del book ang osuira ay gigidil so dunga tokor o ulang ngaseo morang gela mo moswal murula ay gigidil mo godora hotel maluba konsis ba gero gulo spelo mo godora ay murula gigidil dom gok mulase capital investment.
GRT distorts business activity or business arrangements was another observation because instead of setting up commercial arrangements that you might want to do for any number of reasons, you need to structure your business affairs to take the best advantage of a tax. So the tax is interfering with normal commercial transactions.
Toko ang kal TRT tara marken tara wal dulaseng alito tul ayel sentong ra tokora siobay ang botok abolong sangarngi alerada mo selbolom god ora siobay golo rula tokora siobay eto mururingi lo si gesel gotel lungil mortit malubeng gotel biotel rolil en gegre tax malubeng mongira to mungil mortit sentong ra tokora tax ela tam sendo mesang kay TRT.
For example, a GRT taxes businesses, businesses being every separate activity. VAT taxes a person or a legal entity only once, but GRT taxes every business according to the business transactions.
Ela tama a TRT a tax ra sendula sing business e yero guil tokora siobael tub ay gigida malubeng yel kuk siobal mururangara siobal mururangara ay gigida al tax atokora VAT sa tax sa apotokol gombalin motmagerulle imol guktaklol العادة مرولا تقوي VAT أمسها ويجيدل TRT دي أمسها دي one the tama the tal تلتاشو باي.
Another important disadvantage of GRT is it's often very difficult to work out how much tax is included in the price you pay because the tax cascades and at every point of sale there's a tax charge. I was doing some calculations last night on the comparative costs of products that people would buy, and the cost of the product now depends entirely on how many times it's sold because the tax applies for every sale. A GRT applies only once. It may be collected progressively, but it never exceeds the nominated rate. A GRT will exceed the nominated rate.
Director tara yung mesngira tora kay del GRT mal maringela dorula dorura tertela ula sing mal tela taksal harani le TRT sel tal motrak klalo mngia giden sa TRT di tal lola tax ningel tax sa el la tam sel do meseling selil di sel atam el motra klalo say di sel atam el mga tax mal bebi le ngalak sel ngia TRT nia gire del malari ma di VAT di modital lo lari mo particular sing maltela tax non diavolo en alakla mo sigir wolo goitel aklo mesa yel wal el buko ura klal wal sel di sel aktam el motrak klalo ngi di sel aktam moria tax.
So the advantages of the VAT, I mentioned the rate of tax for VAT is constant. In my calculations I've used 10% as an example rate, but that's always the rate. Yes, Senator?
Yeah, and I think it's important to be very clear on this, what cascading means. Cascading means that every time the product's sold, so it goes from store A to store B, and then goes to the consumer, it's actually 4% for that food item, and then another 4%. That's what we're meaning by cascading. Versus a VAT, whatever the rate is, that is the total tax that's paid. There's no additional tax.
So I will not tackle was say sendo sadra cascading mula sa suma klala mo traga tax niya 4% sa klal sa luton mo traga mutang niya mo alel lewal ba sa 4% and this sendo ra VAT and di say gidel el base let's do sa sum mutang 3% and di 3% and ya luton el mo niya ma el ringi sa lora la otrule la klal.
So, Senator, I might just roll forward because I did some calculations last night, and I might just roll forward to show an example of what you said.
Senator, ale bokulum ak mo malas man di malmol man malak lagal bebil susak ngari gelo ulul kurun mang sokal mo ultal wal lokosule gel di goblom regat mo.
So here's one example of something that's taxed at the wharf and taxed locally. It's the diapers which people would buy in the shops anywhere in Palau.
Melang ay tarak klal wel lo uspe ringil o mesa yelo uringi ngatarak klal wel mga atak sa sel sispra adial e direk el mga atak sa ngira al sela blu sela motraw ang tokora o simer ada sabril marara o mesin del basel chobaira abnur belaw.
So this is a rough calculation of the tax that's payable now under the current system and the VAT that might be payable at a rate of 10%.
Mela tayit yalo ura uspe tayid el TRT ma direk el gukul uspe sayid el VAT el sabel di tal tamil hara lo uspe sayid lo ura say tax el basel.
So the landed cost of one carton of diapers is $6.47. That's in the top of the top column, left-hand side.
Mela sel over sayid el hotar baba ma budul aklit atu ngelo ngerung sayid lo ngerung duasan kang kalu mengarnia selwal aral sel gerda ngal selung gayid klalo ngal osime.
And the customs duty on that import was 19 cents.
Lang tamle harara 19 cents in lolsi sabringi.
The retail price of those diapers was $8.95.
La selung mo gayid el adal gel gukwabol tra gelong tala adal direct mo trarngi ang lang mo $8.95 aral.
And the GRT on that at 4% was 35.8 cents, 0.358.
Yes, el wabolo tax ni lo spare sa yidel mutalewal ba cent and 0.358 cents.
So that's the. Sometimes we have a wholesaler who will sell it. Sometimes we have a retailer sell it. But that's one sale. We have a second sale now because someone will buy those and sell them in the shops around Palau because not everybody will import them. That's taxed again. So we have a second retail price of $10.293 cents. That's marked up at 15%, and the tax on that is 41.2 cents.
Mela sel do mes nga ringe yidel adal ni ul sisbi aklalo en ulo turun mora taraat ingelado train ba boy. Ending gayid lo ngero gayid lo ngero adal ni lu ngelo le sisbi ni direct kan sabel gu kotrul mora taraat lo shobal mutlo tarat klalo. Mela sel alu tlo trani en mlamo tendala mla sel bla gayid sayid lebil arar mil arar sayid el price em arania tru email ba sent lu tlo ngos ia aral se klalo awara bol trani.
So if that's sold a third time, there's another 4% tax. So the last column is the third sale, and quite often goods would go through 3 layers of sale in Palau. So if it's sold the third time, there's another markup and another 4% tax, and in the third sale the tax is $0.473, 47 cents. 40.
Mela sayid el domesani mara on edera otro lette claro. El mutel mora al morgel avnia mal ma uspeni. Sayid ablo dubra al sel ablo bela. Blamo wal time la ngas arak ya claro wal time mga tax ang claro. Ingi am arang yid el avel ma uspeni ya claro.
So if we cut that off at the second sale, the total tax and duty paid to the tax division is 96 cents.
Mela sel do mesring il wal nia wablo lubong el tax el lora del hararngi asayid el 96 cents.
Whereas at a 10% VAT, the tax will be $1.02. So they're very similar. People are obviously concerned about the impact of that, but we see that it's a small increase, but not a large increase.
Ndi lasa ukta bodo mesara bi asayid el bat ndi ngilasa di sesel sense wal klo el lulda swira adlen maring el tomdasa se ngarang mo klo lang di irabalu ending maldige gari ngarni o ngarni ding ding.
If we go to the third sale, and I said quite often sometimes goods go through 3 different sales, the total tax collected by the tax division under the GRT system was $1.44, but under the VAT system, the one we proposed, the tax actually comes down to $1.18 because the rate is standard right through the chain.
Mela sel do borsel walia ulobong loral klalo ya senya tax blal harari la TRT imol kluma awama actual cents $1.44 cents. And this sel over sel VAT en mlangmang mlameriol gel wal lo urlo spare ni la VAT adios issue.
So what's the advantage for that to the business person, the one who who sells.
What's the advantage for the business person?
Yeah. What
Well-
does the business person get because of VAT being a little bit?
Well, the business person will pass this transaction on, pass the tax on to the consumer. In this particular instance, the business person, there's many advantages of VAT, but this particular transaction relates primarily to the cost to the consumer. So the consumer is really no worse off when there are multiple sales because of the cascading.
Ela sendo mes tiang et tapagol mo ran gel adan niya walo marang at klaro lo spare ni o yung sedurang at tora bi 18 botoka klungya mo ti gel adan tiya o shobay mding tiya guru niya sa mong moblang taklo sing gel adan niya o mari ya ka la sing nga hotelan or niya oral ng klaro hindi ka mal wal lendio ngod aralak klaro leng tayi del VAT tiya ba sistema de sisiu ge bi
So what's the advantage to the consumer, the one who buys goods? What's going to happen
The advantage
to
under
the
VAT
prices?
for a consumer is the consumer will always know how much tax is in the transaction, and under GRT the consumer never knows how much tax is in the transaction because the price keeps going up every time there's another sale. So if there's 3 transactions involving goods, quite often, as in this case, the VAT becomes lower because it's fixed at one rate. Cascading means you charge tax on tax, so the effective rate gets higher and higher. We think it's 4%, but actually it gets higher and higher because it multiplies.
Aklu ele tiang marado lo mara klalo di back to time lo ora klalo mo di punta na tax al harami di di klalo mari. Yang kan ci arti elanga sel ngon tax ra tax. Mang din sa pulong da sa sing ngawal ba sen tendi OIT sindra tam wang ga gid black klalo en mang sayid cascade di maran mo ba arang ga klalo da mo it sing mat la taxa ablam harami di ga klalo lo ba.
And I think if you look at the chart, the cascading really shows up there because you start at, it's 19 cents, then it becomes 35 cents, then 41 cents. So the GRT and the current tax system keeps on getting bigger and bigger.
Yes.
But under the VAT, it actually starts out bigger and gets smaller.
Yes.
It goes from 65 to 25 to 13, which is good for the government as far as collections because there's less downstream there that you're collecting. Most of the collections are done up front. I think that's an added benefit. And I just wanted to know on the VAT calculation, what percentage did you use there?
I used an example of 10%.
10%, okay, thank you.
Because it's easy.
Say, John, I think it's also important to point out that the cascading effect of VAT at the end of a cascading effect actually pays a smaller amount in tax versus GRT where it's been compounded
Yeah,
in the process.
GRT gets higher and higher. VAT, you know, it's never going to exceed the amount of tax that's been approved by Congress. And my example was 10%.
Why say ang sel liga TRT sel mo sa TRT ang di maran mo ba bang al tax mo sel kasabak rin gani ospera klalo ang club matlo al harari sel mo sa kay del VAT ang sel oran mo ngay gidel om araklal ang ala al harari maldi ya kare al harari nda kal sibel ang alakler sel niya abdu ablan sector niya bulu governmental balu olbilo say tela tax o molan nda kal sel ang alakler say.
And, I've got a number of these, so I'm just going to show you one more because we don't have time to go through them all. But there's one here which is quite silly, and it's a common product here. Yeah, cocoa bread, and it shows how bad VAT GRT can be sometimes.
Ngayam tol ngarinding so kali mo oting ay del imoraklalo le ngatara malblol mo spell niya ngarbe law metayida mal mo oting sel mal Walter Til mal sel ratan mal mo makit at CRT.
Now, there's been a number of transactions in this particular case because the importer will import sugar and flour.
Melang ngariya bek patingela awal lo oriya laklalo mlam patmok raigang le nga ada umara sa sukal ma American ko.
And there's no tax on sugar and flour.
Ela tayo dia ka tax sa sukal ma American.
And then the wholesaler will sell that sugar and flour to the manufacturer of the cocoa bread.
Yalang gigid lo chiso pa get klaro otra gigid sukal ma American gol mora adan niya mamruro nga gigid cocoa bread.
And 4% tax. So the manufacturer of that cocoa bread will make the bread and sell it back to the retailer.
Melang gigid wal bolo ruro nga cocoa bread aruli egu kotruro mora adan niya bolo trar ni mora
4% tax.
Lo liang o sisil 4% tax wa gelu trar American goma.
The retailer will sell it to the consumer, 4% tax.
And
if someone wants to buy those products to put into a coffee shop or a restaurant, the restaurant charges tax, and there's another 4% on the restaurant on that same cocoa bread.
Lilo omlim ko hiringi malubang restaurant dari otrangi mandira ko ewal basen tumun matiraj.
So the greater number of transactions you have, the greater the tax gets. In this particular case, when the coffee shop sells the cocoa bread, the tax on one packet is 27 cents, whereas the VAT would be 25 cents.
Mela sel lildi sela taigi del lom arak klalo sel loral mora ulubong engel adel lila ko hib alo trakal blaang se tuela tax dollar gi am namu 27 cents and dil sum ko mo se ati dil sum ko mo ga VAT and dil lu ma cents.
And I think, John, it's important to note that there's this perception that there's no tax on food, but there actually is tax.
There is tax on food,
and people don't see it.
It is.
So I will go takle chan le ra on da suna sen dia ka tax ra kal. Dikleman to ko yung ngarni mal ngarni tax mura ay kal.
Okay, so please, I'm not suggesting that goods will be cheaper under a VAT. That's not what I'm saying. Some goods may be more expensive. What I'm saying is that GRT is a bad tax because ultimately the tax goes up and up and up every time it's sold, and in some circumstances VAT would be cheaper.
So I will not tackle some of it, masay ngadak tulo say sa lobra VAT ara lakla morio ngaria bebi rata men ngang so tabe sa VAT mo ba ara lakla adi gorgoria sa GRT makit le ringa lata men motra klalo ya ara lak ya taksa mga hindi maran mo ba ngel ara lakla e mo sel dobra VAT ang ay to bebi rata men mo waliasu.
So the VAT advantages which I was talking about before, yes, Senator.
I just want to go back to the cocoa bread. If I was a store with a bakery inside my store, I bake that bread inside my store and I sell it inside my store, that means under GRT I'm only paying 4% tax.
That's quite possible.
Okay.
It's quite possible. And you can see the inconsistency and the unfairness because in some circumstances it's taxed twice or three times. In other circumstances it's taxed once.
And then if I'm a small bakery somewhere in Palau baking bread and I have to take that and go sell it at the, maybe a bigger store that will sell it, and that bigger store will sell it to a donut house to, or some other small store to, then that means I'm as a small business I'm paying more tax than that small grocery store, a big grocery store with a bakery inside, right?
You're exactly right. Sometimes big grocery stores can get an advantage over small stores. Exactly
so
right.
In that way, VAT would be more advantageous to the small businesses, and then we can stimulate a smaller economy for Palau, right?
Yes, that's a fair comment.
Ang bugula sa igel migarel business al sumong rulia blawang yo otrul maraklo shobai bu otrul marakta shobai malmol malmol ngi gidel le otrul ya blawang ngi gel business e otrul ngi aklo taksal harar ni ngam mungwal maalio ngi klol shobai ngia o margel blawang di direk loltrani seguidi a sel domes ngi wal dia al tabsul lomrul masel obra seguido VAT system en morulli mongila mo tangibel tabsul omrul muram general business mo siberulli el bukwal tora age isaram general business mongi murta sel omosper ga gidel VAT ay tay gina ko alti lo hasel tor.
So your point, Senator, is what I've got on this table here. VAT applies equally to everybody at the same rate. GRT discriminates because there's different rates. Some people get advantages, some people get disadvantages because of the number of sales it goes through and the fact that they need to buy off someone else.
Mang teacher umulo ko rin Senator, VAT adi tabsul ng Reklai, GRT adia yung araw sa awan kungela tax sa niya babol sa al endap taharar niya adam dia tabsul murar Reklai adam yung selidi sila tam mo traw ang ngod ara la Reklai why say dia tabsul ya VAT adi tabsul murar adam.
And one of the other advantages of a VAT is that it doesn't discriminate between services provided by public and private enterprises. So sometimes, if we look at the example of telecommunications, a private telephone provider would be liable for GRT, but where that's carried out by a government, it's not liable for GRT. But under VAT, it applies equally to everybody, so there's a level playing field, everybody has the same rules. That will promote private development and private growth.
Atarak lu yun kay idel VAT diyan lesang aklaka raw sara showbay malumang service provider ni no asing service al government provider ni malumang service al hukti agam lo rula business ni sel to tura de wa malumang telecommunications en asel obra chi ating kay idel hukti ni tangal onra telecommunications sa gilel hara chi ating hindi sel book niya public malubang area as well mental los issue provide los issue service ada ala chi ya obra bi 18 dia mo dia so gid klaro sura
So while I firmly believe that a VAT is much better than a GRT, there are some disadvantages generally with consumption taxes, and both are consumption taxes.
Ay tayo nga aswa malubak ko sa aktara malukor kumila sa ngilang kay gidel VAT. Hindi rogo yung tax, gila la ornya la klal ornya service, adi mo nga niya nito to. May igal to blong aja osisyon sweat tax or osisyon teleta la vol tax ni mong ra gidel ornya la service maklal hindi dio nga niya nito to.
One of the major disadvantages from people who don't like VAT is that it's a regressive tax, regressive being the lowest earners are disadvantaged. They end up paying more of their income in tax than high income earners.
Atara selwal dito tula sel tigel ngario alo sugoringi malung ngario do dalo langi ablol tiri amo klo abra morti malung tirgel tira klo lo sistem ni lugaw ba ko klo tuwal bol maaleo sa gidia tara lo mesen.
So if your income is $10,000 a year, you might need to spend all your income on goods and services, so all your income, all your spending is taxed. Whereas if your income is $50,000 a year, you don't need to spend it all on feeding your family, so you might pay less tax on that. That's not really fair.
Sen do mes atara ko sila sen sumka atril tela budem ratara ngo odi mo condition budem sigi do gil budem mashura bla qatlen indi sen gukum mo mes ngil mora ko ka de sen sugra o yim tela tara en jagal bula en klolu do dalo sisibi men jagadi iti rogil di mo o wan go siga aldu ulele agala maklela malmol e jagal sa.
So many countries that decide to implement a VAT make a decision to compensate the low-income earners through some mechanism.
O masin dal balu el tira mo o ngiltil mo spera VAT ang aria tablo los miga aldu ulele mo lo ser tira mal ngario ludo dalo chisberni el malas milwal lo bupol mo ser tira arole lagi abdo.
So I just very quickly want to run through how this VAT has progressed through the Senate in Palau over the last 12 months.
Magsakal di mo talgibel mo masasel wal tetel tel VAT lo sing mal mlaw ang arang artel al sela olbi regal mlaw mregal tulberul buil.
So the first reading of the bill, it's the bill that's before the Senate now, was, I believe, sometime in January this year. I may be wrong by a month or two, but it was early 2013.
Misalnya amli ako tulong ngingil te amiwet te gidel VAT el bila VAT ra sa Senate aw lumu urser ako tal buil ra ta tel nombre ra tel punidon.
Actually, February 6th, so it's pretty close to January.
From that, the IMF in Washington reviewed that bill and gave some our advice. And our advice was primarily that while we all want simplicity, the bill that was tabled before this House wasn't really going to work because it was too simple. It needed to be firmed up.
Ela segi del salto mengel bil em nam dir tila dra IMF Washington betemsa misang gi del walu tason molla mong kida soda beto to indi segi sel bil ni amna dal tial la se tan awal dagal sen wal sen lo mesengi wala al sibel mo ngil lo brior mal ne misal maliliut mal mlagiri ama IMF ulum da ulum sila senggira el mut el momsisi malu mut el momaria ba ale di da so bolla nya mo so ngilo
So just to clarify, that's how we went from 17 pages to 53 pages.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I might, while we're on that topic, mention that the 53-page bill that will shortly be presented is really the Pacific model. It's the model that's used in many countries throughout the Pacific. We know it works. Sometimes tax is more complex than we would like, but not everybody wants to pay tax. So you need to put features in there that make sure it works, and that bill will work.
Melangi ela kadang sa gid maksakal dimut mo ay sa sengegi del 53 page el bill ngaya o sisiu malubang o sindra plura pasifiga ang lamro kayida o spend gid bill leng atokora tax at tipo kale meta ada ka na tax mangira del mula tal tingil ngel gid el bill mo so bel lokmo mo ogyor en mo sa mo ogyor sa mo ogyor en ngil marale ogyor.
So moving on from there, I had the fortune of coming to Palau in May because the IMF wanted to know how serious are you about implementing a VAT, because the IMF did not want to commit a lot of resources if we didn't think you were serious.
IMF ako tem story mo ngit mula say mal maral so miuktel VAT maral ngaraw do swiu lendi mla sorry el amoy tata mama resource manya so lokora dirmi mo say gidia kaulak ni.
So following that, we had the August mission, which I spoke about when the IMF came out from Washington and gave you general advice on improving your tax system.
Ma ogi umulugi wil sayid el August el mekti el IMF ra Washington el mlem to ko wabolo ay sa miguel kukul the suite el gidel kayir tax system.
And then we had the request from Palau for a delegation for a study tour to study VAT in the Cook Islands and New Zealand, and I had the great fortune of accompanying the delegates and members on that study tour.
Me direct la we will receive mula ngari sel walo longitara lo se bol ngari at lo terbelao mo o mes el walo super sel el book system ra VAT ni alo sper ni ara Cook Island yang ngata mula wal tangat lo se ga bo tit ke gidru tera mo.
I just want to add on, and please translate. That was the mother of all junket trip that Chairman Whips, Senator Inabo, Senator Reklai, me as the Chairman of the House, Delegate Ottawa, and Amas took. So please, mamaklat kara ablu la sitya share junket trip im giblorngin.
te itzel logdongan la se tara dimle mili trip le blaria amam members ra te idel gami tira house ma a members ra senate ra te idel gami tiam lori te itzel marala isel no si al trip give blari.
Well, no, I might say, Delegate, that study tours are normally all junkets. But this particular study tour was the best study tour I've ever been on because you were serious and it was not a holiday. You all worked very well, very hard, and we learnt a lot. You learn a lot about how VAT operates in a country like Cook Islands, which is very, very similar to Palau.
Sa di mo motakya diligat la se o mesin diligat la se ngomaral ko mo ko masug mesin dia amral di mo omili hindi nga kasoat ko la se kami ukte triple double ni amral la ni omsu bulan amral ne kanira ramiu emle so mi utokoy nimla ko bom nimla mo ilil especially asal do sa island wa el telvelau kom long no muro yor ko dili li emla ni kasuba unwa terela.
So following all that, because of the success there, I asked Professor Lee Burns to come back to Palau and draft that 53 pages for a new bill, and that's where we are now. Professor Burns was here in December and left that bill with your lawyers to review for transmission to both houses.
Mungultoy lesal wal mal success malu mungilus palel kay system na Cook Island akmulo alingit ngay gid Professor Lee Burns mumula usik kay gid no crockel 53 page bill mumula adra lara kay gid review to mesel ringi elakte gid tialo ringi na.
So one issue that I get all the time from everybody is that VAT is too difficult, and I think I mentioned that earlier on. So I just got a list here of the countries in the Pacific that have VAT who can operate it effectively.
Atara oto klon los pernia adal wal el monda Sengal vi el bata mal tikwo mring la os perni ending soal mo spo olta gid be biram jagrel bulura Pacific el tira os pera VAT mal gal biota tira mruri.
Added to that list now, Kiribati has passed its law. They passed their law in December. VAT in Kiribati will be implemented in April.
Tegid el mesenya dalu di mukler nya gini bas or segid el lulunga ubong el mesenya di sere elang tamla upim la wala ma April segid el December tom gini im lolla mo la werera April elaga.
And in terms of, is it difficult? I know the Pacific. I've worked in the Pacific for 20 years. I've worked in tax for 40 years. I know that Palau can implement it. The capacity of the tax staff and the capacity of the community is as good as anybody in the Pacific.
Mang ajar losing mang maring nga amla urira Pacific luy rak amla ra tax loko rak sen gumes ra alma yel sobela obisa tax sobela ma ayel alma yel sobela buay in mal clo abela clo sobela li o tagid toy.
And some of the performance characteristics of the tax division are better than many countries in the Pacific. So I know they can administer it.
Ma bela mal al samal sabel wa gal bira blul murunitia ending ngaringe gel wal book plak quest ti ladro obisra tax el muktulungi la tetletara biorma adal mutul mudu la bira blul makmaniet mal sabel tan batmo.
So I know we're running out of time, so I just think I might go to some of the main design features of VAT. People want to know how it works. So not as with the VAT that Palau is going to follow is based on the New Zealand model, which is recognised universally as the best and simplest VAT in the world.
Melang selamasih ada temed makal boku kelwan niya tetelet tayid tatora VAT. Melang gel VAT bela mo tirak lani sen VAT New Zealand la Australia. Ese arada muladro ko yang sa kusi sa igid ako talbeyo. E ko tulungin maral beyo tetara VAT sa Pedro Australia.
So there'll be one rate of tax yet to be determined.
Hindi mo ay sigid di mo ngal rate malum sigid niya mo tax ela tam diya mo diya pasentela.
It applies to all imported goods and all all services that are consumed in Palau.
Masel taxa mo taxa ro kul klaro wal dol sisa para kel vela dol sisa marogu el service el rada hara uspe malu to mara klaro a vela sel taxa dimo imo el mortiro.
When goods are exported from Samoa, as is in the case with fish and possibly duty-free sales, there is no VAT on those sales. They're zero rated.
Ela yel tokora wa yel klaro bukti do to wa ni gel ma yel klaro mara duty free a yel model dia ka VAT dia bolo ruta
VAT is collected by people who are registered. It's paid by everybody in the community, but it's collected by people who are registered with the tax division, and everybody who carries on a business with a turnover more than $100,000 per year is required to be registered.
Ela tel VAT a mo mangara ava mo kui tel tira ultra claro tira mo register o visa tax mo e mo te del VAT e tira ro kui tira wan alo ci superingia e galakra a parte tela tira ya mo girir mo register mo ci supra te del VAT.
And one of the major differences with GRT is that under VAT, the legal entity or the person is registered, so not the business. Under GRT, a person could have 5 businesses and have 5 obligations for GRT. Under VAT, 1 person, 1 obligation, 1 legal entity, like a company, 1 obligation.
Ela mo tara mo di ngel af ngel o ngak ngel dia mo register the VAT. Ela tama TRT an sumga di mo la dengan ya claim sio bargau ngira mala taxa wal hara li gid the tama the tax sio bai. Ese lo gore una VAT e qawl ab qawl ngari ya claim tel VAT qaw ya mo hara se gid el tax ndia al bol the tama the tal business am register.
And the beauty of the VAT, the reason it doesn't cascade is because when you file a VAT return, you can claim a credit for all the tax that you've paid on your expenses. So whatever's already been paid on your expenses, you credit that against what you might have to pay for that particular period.
Aknun yele la VAT sa loob ng mahara tax, hindi ak sa igil dula sa hindi sila klalo mo traw sa igisa alem medel tax. Over la VAT sa maigel iloy tuludaw del wa mo sa te igil business. Ay kaya sa malme wa obom minus maluwang mugumutol mo sa sige igil ang tax ang kaharani mo mo.
So I spoke about registered people. A registered person has a turnover greater than 100,000, but there is a provision for people to register voluntarily.
Elang sel VAT say girit trigelada ngara tela le morba ba gelo sisa amo register tutti mo trigil vasite agi register and then direct hook mo aria imal el wal gol sum ka uxuamen el diga mo register en subem el register mo so is mo sumot e vuelta ir tax.
So if you're not a registered business, you pay VAT on all your purchases, everything you acquire to run your business, but you don't have any obligations to pay anything to the tax division. So you don't have the normal obligations of a registered person.
Melan sum diam register da en la VAT gara igel tax sa lo mo sisba igel mo sisba diga yo mara tax ni nding guktiam igel mo pob ma mo traje da mo da bala tax ni lang da bolo sisiwa igel ka gide men haraw ka ma adal ni register da andira bi.
Is there a fee to register?
No, the tax division will collect tax for nothing. We don't charge anybody anything.
Ata obisa tax na kalekta tax na dia ka aral. Dia ka kalekta tax dia ka uli ka kalekta tax.
So VAT will be collected monthly.
VAT aba sel tax abolo la ni avec pel buil.
So people file monthly. Some countries choose 2 monthly. Some countries choose 3 monthly or quarterly, but Palau, the current bill is monthly.
sa domes ang gela niya ano tan mo bekal bui anya bira blue bekler bui mania bira blue bekal core bekler del bui.
Reporting in your monthly return is on a cash receipts and cash payments basis.
May gel also obom report e multu na gel receipts payments.
And one of the beauties of the VAT that you have here is that there are limited exemptions. The only standard exemption which is in your law is for financial transactions, normally with banks and insurance companies.
Atara kung yan lang kayo del VAT ang malmom kasay gel wala al sabi del tax. Sa domes al amir el altan ayan malda al sabi tax ayan tora waba ayan financial transactions ay tora wabang although tax.
An important feature also for VAT is that the price of goods and services always includes VAT. So no one can say, I forgot to charge VAT, so I'm not going to pay it to you. If you forget to charge VAT, it doesn't matter because the price you get for your goods includes VAT.
Arogul claro a cluelera bat arogul claro ma gel bata mo sel tax na sul do tira ka VAT ya tax mo sis brara la claro avec quel tan.
John, if I may.
Yes, Senator.
I think that's an important thing to relate that the VAT, unlike a sales tax that you would see in the U.S., when you would go in a store and you pick up an item, you would go to the register and say, oh, it's not really just $1, it's $1.10 because there's a 10 cents sales tax. Here, in the VAT case, it would be, if you see it on the shelf, it's $1, it's going to be $1 at the register. There's no additional tax added on later. So I think that's something.
That's right, Senator. That's right.
Usala lo taklitan lo single el tax da lo el tax da was el tax am rigel sel obora atana en sebel imo club aral sel omul mera register be kase ase o imo club aral ni ai seguir el 3% mang masa aral ni el 3%. Sel omersal sum tang imo club ngana atana omul mera kase system di yo sisul imo club. Ya mo claro.
So just very briefly, I want to touch on the VAT administration, which will be the responsibility of the tax division.
VAT
will be administered in almost exactly the same way as GRT. There will be very limited changes to the customs operations. Customs probably won't see many changes because all they do is not collect customs duty but charge VAT. So from then it's about what they charge, not what they do. So there'll be limited changes to the actual tax division themselves, but they recognise they need to modernise the way they carry out their business operations, and that's primarily the role of PIFAC, is to help the tax division modernise the way it carries out its business operations.
Al modernize wal butar mula o tetletara o edil mo sisiu imatretara o taxa rulad la tal ese mo le la piftalo no se tir wal titir al mira tretara o yore la tal.
And one of the aspects of that modernisation, with my very limited understanding of Palau, and I think the Minister of Finance touched on the fact that they need an IT system.
Ataramal yen ya girel mo motmokol mo ngil Elbuchel kasong sa lalong makasal el akara tokor bela o sa kureng sa minister kami mula sa to spera esa tokora IT system sa gida lo spell gidi rulil mo o esa atere la tan.
Delegate.
Just a question. Will PIFTAC consider differing the cost of the ET for Palau?
Will we what, sorry?
I mean, would
the cost. Unfortunately, Delegate, I would love to help you with the cost, but PIFTAC IMF doesn't have those sorts of funds. We have funds for tax advisors, so we can't do that. My other point here is that I think you need the help of a tax advisor. I love coming back to Palau, and I will come as often as I need to, but I think you need the help of someone who's here longer term to see you through this implementation stage. And once again, IMF can't pay for that, regrettably.
So I say that yet ding while taking the Torah sen wall involved in oil and more right your pifta anges will seven Mr. Mira Torah aran leng ukigan ludo ngari malu yan ngasawania adios di tax advisor saya tara soal wise na si almost pera tax advisor yang aman muy so ang mutulo mai sin may lo no ser conmigo el tax advisor.
Well, the last things I want to touch on, and I apologise because this is a very bad slide, but I'll explain to you what it means. This is just an analysis of the business community in Palau, taken from the GRT returns. And this analysis says that, and we got this for the purpose of designing what would be a good threshold for Palau.
Tial momesali nila yung akti ko te ayamar linda ang salman ng slide. Tiang ay gaygen lo urel mama wajib mul mesal ide la shogara bul belau el wajib mo moko sel wal ni abol sel bodoturo gorni sel mo abol tensio ay gayid lo ura jimo gulmes o spe menas menase ngara wabol ngil tensio ra tokora gayid bi tira pulur belau.
So this the top line here shows us that 88% of the tax collected from GRT in Palau is paid by 10% of the taxpayers, and that's 80 individual taxpayers and limited companies.
Mela sa dono sa tiang 88% tal nitigay dia ay gatal market tax e mo mas ngay dia ngari dia 2% tira hara or sel sa gida niya tax mo dungul mo to ang ngokay 80 business tira gida hara ni tax.
In the next level, we have taxpayers within the range of 300 to 499, and they only pay 3% of the tax, and it's 4% of the taxpayers who are registered.
Ila sa dono sa sayid el tiel ngara edel dart telal el mura med el email dart telal yang ari tigay del waset del basen tigay dia peringi orto registered and isig del 4%
So the next group of taxpayers, which is from 100 to 300,000, they only pay 5% of the tax. And the last line, 75% of your taxpayers in Palau are in the category of less than $100,000 turnover, and they only pay 4% of the total tax that you collect.
Mela se lo mesa seguir el botón Mario en tin moguido me email basent el other belau tin tirangar belau amos o isra achil se lo hace Mario ra dar te laila al ngaringi di harar ke wal basent.
That means you don't need to have a very low threshold to collect all the tax. If you only register people with a threshold over 100,000, that's still 96% of the tax you'll collect.
Melang bula sendakan dakan sambal bula sengiri nung segi del wan tension lo ban man merio. So el dingar away segi del dartel telal e kami still o mo electra 96% del tax niya so.
And the biggest problem in tax administration in the Pacific is trying to tax that 75%. The small micro businesses is very, very hard work, and quite often you don't get a very good return from it.
And John, I'd just like to add that of those businesses that are under 100,000, the total revenues were only 11 million, or if you translated that to the current GRT,
That's the sales.
That's the sales. So if that was GRT, they're only paying 400,000 in GRT.
Yeah.
So that's what you would be losing if you didn't tax them.
You wouldn't actually even lose that because VAT is collected progressively through the sale chain. So you wouldn't lose 4% because some's paid at customs, some's paid at wholesale, some's paid at retail. So the very small businesses, what you lose is probably their profit on that. So you may only lose, if the GRT if you take 10% of that would be $1 million, you might not collect 100,000.
So this might be an appropriate time to ask, one of our concerns is having two tax systems. So one thing that's been talked about in the public is everybody below 100,000, if that's the threshold, what do we do with them? No tax, zero tax? What do we do?
I'm a firm believer that
Tara niya one monday tar matplod issue mga mesin nila lang si tigigid nga ria so isu ngi which ra tartel tela tiang magarati motoblol nila tax sa mamara la tiget mo ngara do sen tiet.
I'm a firm believer that everybody needs to be in the tax system. So we need to find a system that works for the small and micro businesses. This problem has been addressed in Tonga, and they have now passed legislation so that the small and micro businesses will either pay a very small percentage of their sales as tax, or they might pay a once-only fee for their tax, because it's simple. And Samoa is currently undergoing the same review. They realise that this group of taxpayers with have low turnovers are a lot of work and they don't pay much tax, and the system is too complex for them. So they're looking for a simple system for this small group of micro taxpayers. So the IMF recommendation in August, which I agree with 100%, is that for the very small taxpayers, you keep them in the system, you charge them a low rate of tax on their turnover, you make it as simple as you can, and for the very, very small ones, you should consider charging them an annual tax fee or a 6 monthly tax fee, something of those lines. So, Senators and Delegates, I have a lot more detail in here, but I think at this stage we've been going for quite some time. If you have some questions, I can answer them. I can give you a copy of this presentation with more detail in it, and if you like, I can talk more about it later on. Delegate?
Mr. Hayes, my question is kind of simple, and maybe you need to come up with some figures, but I'm just from the overview of your presentation. Palau is a tourism-driven economy. That's basically our bread and butter for government revenue. We're now at GRT. If we convert to VAT or GST, as New Zealand calls it, what's your general view? Will be better off as a tourism-driven economy to move to VAT?
Well, I think,
or as compared to what we have at GRT?
I believe VAT is a much better system, and I think you would be better off under a VAT. But in respect of the tourists, every tourist that comes here comes from a country that has a VAT. So they're quite familiar with it. And some of those countries have very high VATs. So if you're thinking a relatively low rate, and the average rate in the Pacific is 10 to 15%, it's not going to surprise them.
Trial lo siga turist gumil me ako grabalun lo sperte il system kalbi 80 mo ko mo basura selwal tensyo malubang ngoreng wala la tax el bomo speri wala tam game sa tru me baset malora tru me baset e omo lo speri en dial bol salman ngom malubang salman mo asar ndi tigil turist gumil mera ablur bela.
And because a very high proportion of your consumption is through tourism, most of the tax will be paid by tourists. It won't be paid by people in Palau.
Hindi sa lomesa ni klol ni id klal mo ang maluwi id tora atak sa mga ni turista intong sin turista mo harar sa id tax dahil sa malabal bela.
John, I think it's also important to show to the public, people who are watching this program, we've been talking about the business or the impact of VAT and GRT on business in a sense of business sense. I think it's also important to show the impact on the end user, the consumer. How can this VAT be used, and if the consumer ends up paying slightly more, how can it be used to compensate or to help lighten up that load that might be slightly higher because of given circumstance? Can you please explain?
So I think you're asking me if prices go up and people need to pay more for their goods and services, how do we help them?
Correct.
Great. And there's a number of ways of doing that. And this is exactly what's happened in Kiribati now. They had a very big study about the impact of their VAT. Their VAT was 12.5%. And I think they settled on the effect of VAT on the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, was 1.5%.
Ela sel aku mtas wa kari masing makarang al sumo morba para la claro morara de makara poto masel se gida berada al morti ela wa belura giribas mal nari se gida sel luspeni at 12.5% in tax. Mela tu kuablo lesa se seguir el consumer index los PNI amori mongani sig 1.5% del tira cost.
So Kiribati said, let's look at this separately from the VAT. They decided they wanted a VAT because it was good for the country. They accepted that some people might be worse off. They said we need to come up with a way to help those people who are worse off.
Mela giri basa ulmesini lo se medomesini liliakra VAT. Tamle ngiat pun soria VAT lang atere wil maguli ni tamle ngiat pula se ngani selwa bol bukol la factory mortrige gi del buk bebira ngario putir af mata mlo lil wase almost per VAT ding ngarngi sel lu si sebiring el bukko usis blogi wa bangela VAT mo wa certificate gi.
So you need to decide what works in Palau, because that's what they're going to do in Kiribati. One option, make a direct subsidy to people at a regular interval, a small amount to compensate them for increased costs.
Melang seguida wal sumilo meselin au Kiribati am letara sem le dasu sumilo speni awabol ngari at subsidize ul ngari abon gigren walon maserni trokal time giri trigegi ngario.
Another option, what can we do with wages tax? Can we give cuts with wages tax that might help people and put a bit more money in their pay packet every week?
Wages
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I just want to highlight some things. I think the major issues that we have to tackle now, and we thank you for working together with the minister and coming up with a piece of legislation that's a model that we can use. But the major issue now is we have to decide on a tax rate, we have to decide on a threshold, and we have to decide which other taxes, the excise taxes we would keep and which ones we would eliminate. And one of the concerns I have is, of course, we want to have this tax as revenue neutral as possible. And I know you have the economist here, Minister, and maybe you don't have time at this hearing to answer. We may have to have another hearing to kind of go over the numbers. That's my suggestion. But I just want to throw some numbers out there for you to think about. And I think maybe on Wednesday we might be able to have another just short hearing to discuss this. But just in our experience in the Cook Islands, and I'll give you this as an example. My understanding when we were there is their GDP was somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 million.
Correct.
And they collected about 44 million in VAT off of that 400 million.
Correct.
That's equivalent to about 11% of GDP.
And their rate, I think, was 12.5%.
And their rate was 12.5%. Okay, Palau's current GDP is around 220 million. If I take 10% VAT, and I use, because really the collection on GDP would be 8.8% if we use 10%. That would generate somewhere in the neighborhood of 19.3 million. So when we're looking at the whole picture, we want to make sure that that 19.3 million we've subtracted someplace else. So GRT right now is in the neighborhood of 13.4 million. Okay, that's taken out. Import tax, those other, the import tax at 3%, the cosmetics tax at 25%, maybe that's another 3 million. So that's now 16.4 million. We want to look at other ways of how we make sure that it's revenue neutral, or we have some money to help give back to the people, to help those people in lower assistance. And I mean, I understand the minister's position that he wants 12.5% because of the declining compact funds, but I think one of the issues that we have is that we would like to see that this is not something that we use to collect more money. Maybe we need to we should need to look at cutting our spending. This we're looking at as more of a tax reform issue, not a tax generator. But anyway, that's, and maybe at the hearing, I'd like to hear more about that. But did you want to add something?
I heard you say that in Kiribati they did a study to determine the impact on CPI. I want to see if we have something like that done here, and what's going to be the impact on the CPI and categories of different
I think possibly the economists might be able to work on that, and we might ask Mark about whether that would be feasible. Unfortunately, the study in Kiribati, it took a long time, and a lot of the conclusions we knew already. The only really relevant conclusion was that it was about a 1.5% increase in CPI. Now, Mark would be better equipped than I to deal with how you could possibly consider that.
Yeah. I think the comments that you're making are largely correct. We can do something similar here in Palau, but it will take a little time. It's not something I can give you next week. We are working with statistics. We're building up the statistics base. It'll take a month or two before we can actually provide you with a detailed study. But I would say that if you went with the 10% VAT, probably the figures would be somewhat similar in terms of its impact on CPI. Some prices will rise more, and others will probably be compensated in the other direction. So food prices are likely to go up slightly more because they don't pay any import tax. So will some of the service items in communications and utilities. They probably will rise more, but then there is likely to be some offsets elsewhere. So it won't be a general rise in prices, it will be a mixed bag. But as I say, I think we need to do a little bit more work on this to provide you with more definitive figures. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll discuss when we'll have our next hearing, but I just wanted to put those thoughts in everybody's mind, and then We have another hearing with the people of IRI at 7 o'clock, and it's now 6:19 here. So, kuradi oisa bualo sing diri ka batuka agir sa drogira ministere mutul discuss at yan mo kamangal hindi nga risel hearing kita mutira adrairera 8 o'clock. Makulito kasi sumari aso mo korado el edim dung hindi kung dasang agir mutul mo imura hearing ikadar mutul mo makatakla babira issue hindi tikutel te alle klutro nga suliw ra uriol bladder elin mera lang yata continue makalo uriol el mongila understanding tial blur belal giret tial el gida mo donya sing besel tax and actually tia tax reform sulang
Saule, Chairman, direkal dikutal te alle kurenga sule mga ma kami kiragaw ma rather house, Chairman house. Akti direkal sakal di mo conclude tal hearing al wasiam. Kita ngayel blam dula setyang dekal beselulas kung kita swada reform ra tax sergid. Besel di reform tal tax sergid ang gire rulil gire dal mo modern tax. Rulil ngara low rate el sel kita domtas beng ngungirar atara blue gida blur belas el generate a income el run government ngil da necessary we have to make money usel 12.5% agi diblem chachester ngil el gora oul ngara mider tial recommended IMF fra 10 to 15 and the like you said and gire mo mesa number and mo determine sel appropriate el tax structure malube chegi del tax al kita mo swada mo o loyal mo tagi del bill mo adra blue mo adi to keep in mind al kita pal al pangarngi asing sel bol all dungul merio e do bal morba be mo mring rigid sel toru ringi ase sel mo virar be class se kita podungu e mo mo implementari ang ngayon hindi so kal di bring ngil mora attention rigid la setiang basically mo replace sel chapter 12 title 40 tel wat mela la argid ngungil obo mo mesengi make sure ay gero gul ngara alsela maral da gaber ma tianga mo replace ngi mo obo ay gel obo ngara alsel sei mong seguide sermena di ong mamal dire aseng kadamhal mo ngil subi mo ngil educate travelul kirel letara mo betengela ureora Ministry of Finance, especially Revenue of Tax, adra blue sel bolo dangli tagi dulur e mo beota implementation ngi mabreri mabrera ma adiregal mo beot mangwai se chairman ng waigel oblamdong lo se ka officer ma mo available vehicle time bornya hearing malubeng idil time somo agi bom mega comment malubeng gi megi mesagmiu e bodota ke do dagat maklitiang ang sungai terngi aseng mo ngirar beklat adik ma hearing el kuktik ma comment terkam metiang kimbergong kimobrenga suliura tal palungil hearing
Sula minister hala di kulitra chairman isal Baules marital hearing ngidre lansins
Sulagat se musumurgaw digdebe akir nga siya tol dilia Mr. Hazel waman nung ngi Kumamtiar olbe musu bara hearing makomem ko do wise share information ask questions di Mr. Hayes mo dudil ko asing goram la niya start rurior Ministry of Finance adra tax gora absu bertial PS system mungwala olbe lam su bringi deliberation tial bill madam ra finance to direct na meng miarungo dule atara gim silubir seragi mora New Zealand ma Cook Island takasyak mark club gul we spend about an hour or two the expertise ra GST sel value added tax New Zealand tamis kama sel GST customer service ertir aku meral wasiakot club gul sel bornya la tax reform magarang assume itu ta customer service and then it's not going to work. So, akmal lo ulang asulem, kuram nam ulia ulo mentira, tigal consultant tergidra, gora kaya head start program ra alsela, Ministry of Finance gora o mesetya ma implementation ngi, se bolo ulo ya customer service tergidra ma taxpayer, ang sa gidra level taxpayer sa expectory. Di sila sokal mokbo sa at siya mga asal mo siya close.
Wala yung setial hearing di mertiang ado commercial hearing rin kita ray, mamsula.